What sorts of small arms lessons did the British government take away from the Boer War? That's the question we're going to be looking at today. Thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum. I'm here today at the James Julia Auction House up in Maine, taking a look at some of the guns that they're going to be selling in their spring-April of 2017 auction. And amongst those are these two rifles. These are very early SMLEs, or short magazine Lee-Enfield rifles. Now, the British government in the Boer War really had its first opportunity to go into combat with Lee Metfords, long Lee rifles, and Lee carbines against what was basically a European opponent, European trained and European equipped in the Boer colonists. Those guys had, among other types of obsolete rifles, they also had a lot of very modern repeating Mauser rifles. And the British had an introduction to what would become modern combat in this war. And one of the outcomes that they took away from it was that they really didn't need to have a different rifle for infantry and cavalry. The British, like most other nations, had been using these two separate lengths of gun. They had a 30.2-inch barreled rifle for infantry, and they had a 20.75-inch barreled carbine for the cavalry. The idea was the cavalry needed a very short, handy carbine because they're riding around on horses and they're going to be using this thing with one hand a lot, and you don't want it very heavy. Where the infantry didn't have that size constraint on them, and also the infantry were going to be firing in ranks, and so you wanted to make sure that the barrel was long enough to safely get past the front rank of soldiers when it was being fired from the back rank. Well, by the turn of the century, 1900, these issues were kind of starting to fade, and in 1901 the British formally decided to look at a unitized or a rationalized short rifle. Let's make a compromise gun and give it to literally everybody. It'll simplify the logistics. The cavalry will get a more accurate gun or a more shootable gun. The infantry will get a lighter and handier gun. This seems like a pretty good idea. And in fact, it was a great idea. This would get adopted as the SMLE, and pretty much every country in the world would go on to make this sort of change from two lengths down to one. You'll see it with the United States, going from Krag rifles and Krag carbines to the 1903 Springfield, which was a standardized short rifle. You'll see it with the Germans having carabiner Mausers and rifle Mausers, going down to the Kar 98K, standard pattern short rifle, and everyone else did it as well. Now, when the British looked at this, they had their long rifle had a muzzle velocity at this point of about 2,000 feet per second, and that was with a 30.2-inch barrel. And they discovered that they could shorten the barrel to 25.2 inches, and they only lost about 40 feet per second. So they went from 2,000 to 1960, and that was basically nothing. That was immaterial. And in the process, they were able to take 1.5 pounds off the weight of the light rifle, so 3/4 kilo, or off the weight of the long rifle, which was a substantial weight reduction. The new short rifle was only about 1/4 kilo, 8 ounces heavier than the carbine, and it had about a 5-inch longer barrel. So they really pretty much split the difference right in the middle with barrel length. But they substantially reduced the weight of the gun. This all seems like a pretty good thing. In 1902, they manufactured 1,055 of these new experimental short rifles for troop trials, and they did so in two different variants because they had two different styles of rear sight that they wanted to try out. There was the A pattern, which is this one, and the B pattern, which is this guy. And they were both tested in 1902 by a variety of units. They were tested out by the British Navy, the British Army, the British Marines. And what's interesting is, unlike what you often see in trials rifles, these trials reports came back almost uniformly positive. There were a few elements to these rifles that people were unsatisfied with, but as a general concept, everybody really liked them, and they were quite successful. Ultimately, it was really only the target shooting fraternity in England at the time that had serious objections to the short rifle concept, and that was because the shorter sight radius did have an effect on very precise target shooting. The military correctly judged that that difference was negligible and meaningless in combat, and went ahead with this anyway. So let's go ahead and take a closer look at these two. They are literally the only surviving examples of the A and B pattern trials rifles of this type, and there are a number of features on them that we can take a look at. How these guns changed from the Lee Metfords, and how they would change later on into the standard pattern SMLE that we're used to from World War I. One of the most significant things that would change on these new short rifles was the change from a manually loaded magazine to a stripper clip loaded magazine, or charger loaded as the British would call it. That, of course, requires some sort of guide in which to place a stripper clip, or a charger clip. And that guide is right here. Now what's interesting is on this first pattern of the SMLE, this is actually a movable piece. So the left side of the guide is built into the wall of the receiver. The right side of the guide is attached to the bolt head, and it travels forward and back as the bolt does. So you only actually have a stripper clip guide when the bolt is open. In addition, the dust cover was deleted from the rifles. This made them simpler to disassemble, and I guess the British had found that the dust covers just weren't all that practical or important. The safety was updated and improved. The safety is now here, that's fire, and that is the safe position. Prior to this, the safety had actually been a lever on the cocking piece itself. So that was a nice improvement. These rifles retained volley sight still, which allowed them to shoot out to 26 or 2,800 yards. So there's the rear volley sight, and here's the front volley sight. The bayonet attachment was also changed, and this is more substantial than people might recognize. What was being done here was to no longer attach the bayonet to the barrel, but rather to attach it to this nose cap, which is affixed to the stock. The idea was to take the pressure off the barrel itself and reduce the amount of the change in point of impact that would result from having or not having the bayonet fixed. This nose cap is part of what gives the SMLE its really distinctive look. The idea is the loop on the top of the bayonet doesn't go over the barrel anymore, it goes over this plug on the front of the nose cap. Now, with these trials rifles, the front sight protectors were actually a complete circular bar. Interestingly, that's one of the elements that troops really did not like. That was not popular. It was instituted primarily for cavalry use of the guns, because of course the cavalry had scabbard, bucket-type scabbards on the side of their horses that they would drop the rifles into muzzle first, and it was important to give the front sight good protection. But this would ultimately be basically cut off and result in two large rabbit ears or wings on the front sight, which is what the adopted SMLE would have. Now this particular rifle also has this interesting lug on it. That is also there for cavalry use. That was to allow the gun to be held at the ready position more easily by cavalry. Pretty rare thing, was not actually adopted. In an interesting step towards modernization, the magazine cutoff was actually omitted on these trial rifles. It was, I guess, decided that it simply wasn't necessary, that part of the drill was also obsolete and outdated, which is true. However, that decision would be overturned and the magazine cutoff would be reinstituted when this was adopted as the official Rifle Mark III. The reason we have two rifles here is that the troop trials involve two different models of the gun, and they really differ only in the rear sight. They also differ in the handguard, but that's simply as a result of the rear sight being different. This is the A pattern, and this is the B pattern. The A pattern is what would ultimately be adopted, and it is a front-mounted tangent sight, like so, and you squeeze the button here, and you can adjust your elevation. That elevation goes from 200 out to 2,000 yards in 100-yard increments, and it does also have windage adjustment back here with this dial. Just moves the whole rear notch left and right. Now you'll notice there are a pair of wings back here, and at first sight those look kind of stupid because, well, why would you put the protective wings back here instead of around the rear sight? Well, the answer is these wings are to prevent the sight from being damaged if you drop the rifle on top. So they are there, and that's why there are these metal caps on the top of them. That's to protect anything hitting the top surface of the rifle. And so they do their job just fine back here, and at the same time, they also don't interfere with your ability to adjust the rear sight. So then this is the B pattern, and it has a rear-mounted sight which flips up for long-range shooting instead of being a tangent like the A pattern. On this one, your long-range bar goes from 500 to 2,000. It does also have windage adjustment right here. There are no clicks on this, it's just a constant turning thread. And one of the main differences on this is that the elevation slider here is friction only. On the A pattern guns, there are notches cut at every 100-yard increment, and so the sight locks firmly into place. On this guy, the rear adjuster, it's tight because it's friction only, but what you do is squeeze this button in and then slide it up and down. And they found two problems with this pattern of rear sight. One was that it got very hot after you'd been firing a lot because it is the connection to the barrel was, I guess, too close. The other problem was that the slider tended to move when you were firing. So the friction wasn't enough to actually hold it in place, and that's an element where the A pattern rear sight had a substantial advantage. Is it, a particularly important technical thing? Is it something that could have been changed? Sure, it easily could have been changed, but it wasn't. This was the pattern that had been proposed, and this was its competitive pattern. This is the one that was better, and this is the one that was ultimately adopted. So it would normally be rather unusual for a gun that was made in a quantity of over 1,000 to be almost completely gone today. Usually things survive a little bit better than that. However, what happened to these is that in 1906 and 1907, they were obsolete. Of course, they were trials rifles, and especially the B pattern guns, which hadn't been adopted and had these non-standard rear sights. These were all considered basically scrap. Yes, they have historical value, but for the military, they weren't particularly useful, and they were virtually all converted into .22 caliber training rifles. That was one of the things that the British often did with outmoded patterns is, well, the receivers are just fine, the basic mechanisms are fine, we'll redo the stocks and the sights and convert them to .22 caliber rimfire and use them for training. And that's what happened here. So because of that, these are the only two existing 1902 trials rifles that are known. That conversion is really exacerbated by the fact that there were no distinguishing marks on this first batch of trials rifles. So normally on an Enfield, you would expect markings on the socket on one side or the other. There's nothing there. And there are no marks here on the right side either. Nothing at all. We don't even have anything except the serial number up here on the front of the receiver. Nothing on the top. So once these guns were converted into .22s, there was really no way to distinguish them from any of the other .22 rifles that were in service. So with just a couple of minor little upgrades, like changing the front sight protector to be ears instead of a continuous band, this, the A model trials rifle, would be formally adopted in December of 1902 as the short Lee-Enfield Mark I, and it would actually go through a couple of updates fairly quickly, and by 1907, it would take the form of the rifle that we call today the rifle number 1 Mark III. The most significant of those changes was to replace this moving charger bridge with a fixed one. We'll talk about that in another video, but that was the main change that they went through. And then also some little things with style of the rear sight. At any rate, I should also point out that this was the short Lee-Enfield Mark I. What we think of today as the rifle number 1 Mark III. The difference there is a change in nomenclature that the British made in the mid-1920s and then applied retroactively. And that's when short Lee Mark I became the rifle number 1. Just a little difficult quirk of British rifle nomenclature. So anyway, these two are really the genesis of what is arguably the best bolt-action battle rifle ever fielded, the iconic SMLE, the SMLE. Better than its name makes it sound, I suppose. At any rate, both of these are, of course, coming up for sale here at the Julia Auction House. If you're interested in either one, and of course, these are the only known examples of both the A and the B pattern trials rifles. Well, if you're interested in having them yourself, certainly the centerpiece of any Enfield collection. Take a look at the description text below the video. You'll find links there to Julia's catalog pages for both of these rifles. You can take a look at their pictures and their description and provenance. And if you're interested in bidding, that's only a click away on the website. Thanks for watching.